In the past few lessons, we've set up already most of our user interface. We've got the background layouts, we've got pretty much all of the column structure set up, and we've also got our list view. But now we need to look at the second part of our mockup, and we need to create this little pop-up thing that comes up from the bottom to allow our user to add any new to-do list tasks. Now, if we head over to the Flutter docs, and if we take a look at the very bottom, our widget index, and you can scroll through and you might come across something called a bottom sheet. So bottom sheets slide up from the bottom to reveal more content. That sounds pretty much like exactly what we want, right? So let's click on it to read a little bit more. And it tells us that there's two kinds of bottom sheets. One which is persistent, so something that shows information that supplements the primary content, so a little bit of extra content, but it stays visible even when the user interacts with other parts of the app. So that's probably not what we want. We don't want it to stay there all the time, right? So instead, what we want is a modal bottom sheet, which is something that prevents the user from interacting with the rest of the app because it's going to be highlighted and it's going to come up as a little pop-up where the user can type in their new task, and then once they're done, it can pop away and for us to go back to the main user interface. So the way that we create these modal bottom sheets is with something called a show modal bottom sheet function. So let's click on it to find out a bit more. You can see that this function has two required properties. It needs to take in the current context, which allows it to look up the navigator and the theme to see how it should lay out this bottom sheet to be consistent with the rest of your app. And also it needs a builder, so a widget builder. And a widget builder is simply a function that takes the current context and returns a widget. And in this case, it's going to be returning a bottom sheet widget. So let's see how we can implement it. So if we head back into our onPressed, well, this is the part that should trigger that bottom sheet to pop up. So let's call our show modal bottom sheet. Now notice you have to be careful. There's a show bottom sheet, which shows the persistent type, but the one that we want is actually the little pop-up that comes up with an animation as well. So the context that we're going to pass in is, of course, the current context of our widget from our task screen. So in our case, it's actually not all that much that's going to be passed over because we don't have much in the theme, but we do have a navigation stack. So we can tell it where it is in that navigation stack. But we've also got this builder method. And you can see that this thing wants a function to be passed in. So let's create a function up here. And this function, if you remember, has to return a widget and have a context as an input. So notice how this is actually really similar to our build method that we've been using all the time. So the output is a widget, and let's give the method a name. So build bottom sheet. And then it takes an input, which is of type build context, and we can call it context. And then it's got to return a widget. So in this case, it's going to return whatever we want to show inside our bottom sheet. So what do we want to show? Well, let's say that we just return a container, shall we? Just a really simple thing. And of course, make sure that you can actually spell, unlike me. You got widget instead of widget. So now inside our builder, we can pass in this method that we've just created, which is called build bottom sheet. And if we go ahead and add a semicolon, then we've now set up our show modal bottom sheet. And it's pretty short, actually, if you just look at it. But now when we press on the button, that's the moment of truth, and we get a bottom sheet that pops up from the bottom and builds a container widget to show us. Now, how can I be sure that we've got actually our container? Well, let's give it some text, shall we? Let's give it a centered text, which is going to be, this is a bottom sheet. Let's hit save, and you can see we've now got access to this bottom sheet area that we can put whatever content we want, and you can see how it darkens the rest of the user interface, so we can't interact with the rest of it. But as soon as we click away, then it animates and drops down to the bottom, and then it animates up, animates down. I could play with this all day, but I won't for your sanity. So now that we know how we can create these bottom sheets, let's delete the little bit of dummy content that we've got in there. And let's go ahead and create some real content. Notice how we could have this very wordy method here, build bottom sheet with a name, and also have a return. But we know that when we just want to return one thing, so a single line item, well, in this case a container, we can actually delete the semicolon, delete the return keyword, as well as all of the curly brackets, and replace it with our arrow function. Now we have a single line code right here. We can make this even shorter by, instead of having a named function, build bottom sheet, we can just make it an anonymous function. So let's go ahead and take all of this part, and we're going to cut it and replace the function here with what we had before. So now we can delete the name and the return type, and of course this context input also doesn't need the type here either. It can infer it from the context that we pass in from over here, which is a build context type. So now our code is very, very short, painfully short almost, but the functionality is still exactly the same. And instead of creating a container and building out a massive tree over here, I'm actually going to take this and create a brand new file inside our screens. So let's create a new Dart file called the add task screen. And here we're going to create the widget tree for what we want to see inside this little bottom sheet. So instead of returning a container, I'm going to return a add task screen. And I'm also going to import my screens folder and the add task screen.dart file. So now let's go over here and actually create something called add task screen. And inside this screen, what do we want to have? Well, if we take a look at our mockup, you can see that we want to have maybe a title, so a bit of a text widget, and then a text input, something where the user can write the actual task, and then we can just have a flat button that says add. But before we create all of this interface, there's just one thing that's very obviously different. Namely, in our mockup, we wanted to have curved edges for this bottom sheet, similar to how we've got our list, to make our app look really consistent in its design. But at the moment, we've got this very square looking bottom sheet. Even though it's very cool, it's still not exactly what we wanted. So let's look at how we can create this. Well, we've got our container, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a color that is going to be exactly the same as this background color. On a Mac, there's something called a digital color meter. And what it allows me to do is basically it gives me a color dropper. And you can install similar color dropper tools on Windows as well. And I'm going to hover over here and see what the value for this color is. So at the moment, it seems like it's something like 117, right? So red is 117, green is 117, and B is 117. So now with these values, I'm going to go into Chrome and I'm going to search for RGB to hex. And you end up with this little color picker tool in Chrome where you can change the values of these things. So we had 117, 117, and 117. So it's this gray color. And the hex code is right here, which is kind of hashtag 757575. So let's go ahead and copy this over to our code. So the color is going to be constructed using the color widget, and it takes an integer value. So if you remember from before, we had to do the 0xff to replace the hashtag or the pound sign, and then we end up with the integer value of our color. So now if we hit save, you'll notice that this thing that pops up is now pretty much indistinguishable from the background. So we're going to use that as the first container. And then inside this container, I'm going to add another container. Now, bear with me. This seems a little bit weird what I'm doing, but it's going to become clear very soon. Now, in this container, I'm going to add some decoration. It's going to be a box decoration, and the color is just going to be a white color. And then, of course, we have our border radius. So now we can add a border radius with the top left and top right with a 20 circular radius for both. And now if I hit save, you'll see that when this bottom sheet pops up, there's actually one bottom sheet at the back which has that gray color that matches with the background. And then there is another one inside that container which has the rounded edges. So this allows us to have this little curved edge bottom sheet, and it looks really neat because it fits in with the rest of our design. So now all we need to do is to add in the rest of the things that we see in our mockup. So we've got a large-ish title that says add task, a text field, and a flat button. So here's another challenge for you. Pause the video and see if you can recreate this exact layout using what you've learned about widgets and laying out UI using Flutter widgets. And once you're done, once you've given it a go, then come back and I'll show you my solution. So pause the video now. All right, so how did that go? Well, here's my version of how you could do this. And there's a million ways of doing the same thing, as always, with Flutter. So just because yours is different from my code doesn't mean that you got it wrong. As long as you get this end result, then you've pretty much achieved the objective. Inside our container, I'm going to add a child, which is going to be a column, because again, everything is laid out vertically, one on top of the other. And in this column, it's going to have some children, the first of which is going to be a text widget. The second is going to be a text field widget. And the final one is going to be a flat button widget. So now I've got three things, and I'm going to give my text widget the name of add task. So now when I hit save, you can see my three widgets show up. They all look really ugly, but we're going to change it right now. So firstly, the text widget, let's add some style to it. So let's add a style property, which is going to be text style. And I'm going to change the font size to make it a lot bigger, to make it maybe 30. And then I'm going to change the color to make it our favorite color in this module anyways. The colors.light blue accent. And now it looks a bit better. So onwards. Next is our text field. And our text field is actually encompassing the whole length of this, because when I click on it, you can see the blue underline show up and the cursor is almost invisible at the very left. Now, the other thing I want to change is when I pop up this little bottom screen, I want this text field to be automatically already enabled, because you can see that if I hold Command K to bring up my keyboard, or on Android you would toggle this little button right here, and I want it to automatically show up this keyboard whenever it pops up so that I don't have to click on it. Given that there's only one text field, it makes sense for us to automatically enable this text field so that they can start typing straight away without having to have the extra step of tapping on this. And to do this, I'm going to add the autofocus property, and I'm going to set it to true. So now if I hit save and we open up our bottom sheet, you'll see that it's automatically enabled. This bottom line is blue and our keyboard pops up every single time. The other thing I want to do is to address the fact that our cursor is pretty much off the screen. And I can bring it to the middle by simply changing the text align property to text align center. And now you can see when I press the add button, the cursor shows up right in the middle and it's already enabled and ready to go. The final one is of course our flat button. So let's give it some text by giving it a child, which is a text widget, and it's just going to read add. And then I want to give it a color, which is going to be the light blue accent. But when I hit save and hot reload, you don't actually see it show up. And the reason is because our flat button is currently giving us a warning, namely that the parameter onPressed is required. And when the onPressed is not supplied for a button, then it defaults to a disabled button. So the color isn't showing up because our button currently is disabled. So let's go ahead and add the onPressed that it requires. And here at a later date, we'll probably add some code so that we'll add our task to the list. But right now I'm just gonna leave it as it is. But as soon as I hit save, and once we've got our onPressed and our flat button is not disabled anymore, you can see our background show up. And now I want to fix that text. So let's change the style to make it white. So text style, and the color is colors.white. All right, so now let's hit save. And the final thing that you'll notice is different between that one and the mockup is this button goes edge to edge, right? Or pretty much the same width as the text field. So how do we do that in our code? Well, we can change our column cross-axis alignment to make it stretch from side to side. And then let's go ahead and change the text widget's text align property to center as well. Now notice the first property of text has to be add task. So if you try and add another property in front of it, it's not going to like that very much because this doesn't have a parameter name. It doesn't have something like text widget with text something colon. So it needs that positional data, and its position must be the first in the widget. So we have to let it be first, and we have to treat it with extra special care. So now that we've pretty much created everything that we have here, all we have to do is add some padding around our column. So let's go ahead and add some padding into our container right here, which wraps our column. And I would say that we could probably get away with simply just adding maybe all sides, and let's add good old 20 pixels. And it looks pretty much like what we see over here. Now you can of course add some padding between this field and the add button if you wish, but I think at the moment that actually looks fine. But of course feel free to modify the appearance as you like. So now we have pretty much replicated our entire mockup. We've got our area at the top, which describes our list. We've got our actual list view with some list items. We've got a pop-up and animated bottom sheet. And we've now got everything inside that screen laid out as well. So now we're pretty much ready to move on to the next stage, where we look at how we make it all work and make it all come together. And the first thing I want to address is, why is it that our checkboxes don't work? So have a think about that. And to find out the solution, I'll see you on the next lesson.